Perhaps, how many do you know? Go on, just with the person next to you. How many different approaches could you name? Okay, so I'll give you one for free. Communicative language teaching, there you go. Sorry, I've taken the easiest one for you. Do you know any others? Just with the person next to you. Go on, see how many you could say. You know, we have CLT, TBL, dogme, lexical approach, demand high, TPR, natural approach, direct method, suggestipedia, grammar translation, oral situational, community language, silent way, clear, audio linguism, rote learning, visible learning. Okay, do you know any of those you don't know? Perhaps one which might be new is the idea of visible learning. This is a thing I've been interested in, which is, it's actually from mainstream education. It's not technically an approach of English language teaching, but it was a guy called John Hattie, and he did a lot of research into the research in education. So to find out what worked and what didn't work. And what he found was more or less everything works, except keeping students back a year was bad for their education. Hope it doesn't happen here, but maybe in some places it does. And so what he did was he looked into the idea of what worked better. And one of his key things was feedback. And this wasn't feedback where we kind of say, well done, good job. It was more to do with encouraging a dialogue in the classroom where the students are showing what they know. Okay, and we may touch on this later. So we find out what they know in order, and what they don't know, in order for us to be able to progress their teaching. Okay, usually, I don't know if you've do a CELTA or Delta, what we end up saying is, we learn, my teaching is principled eclecticism. So the idea is that we take a little bit of each of these ideas and we put them together, and that is our approach. I think that's reasonable, but there's an applied linguist called Henry Widdowson, and he once said that if you are eclectic without any principles, you're not principled, you're confused. So, in a way, what you could describe, I sometimes say that teaching lexically is two teachers' principles and the eclectic practice that they do in the classroom as a result of these principles. Obviously, that doesn't fit on the cover of a book, or it's very long and it's not a very short title. So we give it a name, we call it Teaching Lexically. But really what I'd like you to do is, even if maybe you don't agree with what I discussed today, hopefully what you'll do is reflect on your own principles. What is it that you believe about teaching and learning and language? And how is that reflected in your practice? Is it reflected in your practice? Because I think often what happens in education is basically we just do the same as how we were educated. And we inherit our principles without really articulating them. And we go on and just do stuff because that's what we've always done. So maybe there will be a thought, a way of changing. Okay, so what are the principles we might talk about? Okay, here are some. Why learn a language? This is from the Common European Framework of Reference. Everybody familiar with this? A1, A2, B1, all that kind of thing. Okay, hands up who's read the book, the Common European Framework. There's a book? Yes. 300 pages long. I recommend it if you're an insomniac. have it by your bedside. It'll send you to sleep quickly. But actually, there's, the familiar can-do statements only make up about a third of the book. A lot of the other ideas around it are, I suppose, questions and challenges to teachers to think about how they teach. And the first few pages, you see, I managed to stay awake for this long. It says this, it's on page 3, okay? So you don't have to read too far. Why learn? Deal with the business of everyday life in another country. Exchange information and ideas with young people and adults, okay? Are we young or are we adults? Let's say we're both, we're young adults. Communicate their thoughts and feelings to them and achieve a wider and deeper understanding of the way of life and the thought of other peoples and their cultural heritage. Okay, interesting. Now, again, with the person next to you, think of your last class. Did you deal with the business of everyday life? Did your students exchange their thoughts and feelings? Did they get a deeper understanding of a cultural heritage? It's a bit scary sometimes, this question. I think, often what happens, would anybody disagree with this as an idea? I have heard people also offer curiosity as a reason to learn. But let's face it, that is a very small minority of most of our students who are just naturally curious in a language and just interested in it for language's sake. For most of us, this is our goals. We want to speak in the language, we want to communicate with other people. But sometimes, when we have English or French or German as an academic language, and our goal is to get to maybe university and study this language at university, we lose sight sometimes of these reasons. So whatever your approach, bear this in mind. Perhaps we need to ensure that the students are getting these opportunities in the classroom. Okay? So that's the first possible principles we could have, that our classes should be related to the business of everyday life. We should give opportunities for exchanging thoughts and feelings, and maybe the cultural heritage. I think this is less, maybe is... So, what about what you need to do? There's thousands of pages, millions of books, thousands of books written about language learning. We have all these different approaches. What is it that we have to do to actually learn an item of language? Now, at the moment, let's not worry about what an item is. It could be a word, it could be a phrase, it could be a grammar rule or whatever. Again, with the person next to you, what do you think? I have 6 phases or 6 things that need to happen. I have had correspondence on the internet with people who disagree, so it may not be everybody's taste. But I feel that within most approaches, these things happen. What's different is maybe the order that they happen in, and what might be different is the way they do these things, okay? And for me, that is partly where the eclecticism is, okay? So, for example, we could say task-based learning starts with do something. So we give them a task, they have a go, and then at some point, the communication breaks down, and the students themselves, or with their teacher's help, introduce a new item or a new language for them to overcome this breakdown in communication. And then they go back to their kind of understand the meaning. In a way, the meaning has come from their breakdown, if you like. Yeah? And we would assume then that perhaps they would either, they've seen it in context because they're talking about it, they've probably been trying to say it because it was a communicative task, And then the teacher's job might be to draw attention to some aspect of the grammar or the vocabulary and notice its features, if you like, so that they can then make use of it either to continue the task or repeat the task, or maybe at another time in the future. Yeah? So it doesn't necessarily have to go. We could say grammar translation, it starts with a kind of, maybe it starts with a context, I suppose, a sentence, which the students then have to translate, so the meaning comes from the translation. Maybe they don't approximate the sounds of the item. So maybe this is one of the kind of lack in a grammar translation approach, that perhaps the students don't get the opportunity to say the language enough. And as a result, although they can read and write quite well, maybe at the end of it, they can't speak so easily. Okay? So, I think, anybody have any extra or different things that you would include here? No? I mean, again, we could look at natural approach, a kind of acquisition. You could see that as being seeing the item in context at that step just above our level. And that's where we acquire the meaning. We kind of guess the meaning from that context. And then, again, maybe the teacher, perhaps there's not the same. So one of the issues is, are they noticing this language enough? So maybe the teacher intervenes in there and then they do something. Again, doing something, you could also describe it as integrating it with your existing knowledge, so that we have to kind of bring this language into what we know already. Okay, so this is, I think, reasonably uncontroversial. Reasonably, maybe I have a doubter in the front, perhaps. We'll come to it later. Okay. Where there are, these thousands of pages where people differentiate in a way are these areas of debate, I think. So one is, can we learn a language? Are doing exercises and studying it actually the real way we're going about it? Or is basically, the more efficient way is to acquire it? So I know that Vitaly is going to be talking a little bit about this later. So, he may have a slightly different view to me, okay? It's fine. What we're doing is thinking about our principles. All of these different approaches have successfully, to some degree, taught students, okay? The results may be slightly different in their outcomes. But we have to be humble and recognize that whatever our suggestions of improvements, they're going to be small. And in a way, it's feeling comfortable in your approach and your principles. Second might be what language to teach, okay? And this is an area I'll be looking at more. What do we mean by an item of language? Is it a grammar rule? Is it a single word? Those kinds of things. Then once we've decided on those items, what is the order we should teach them in? There may be a dispute about that. What happens in correction and feedback when the students have done their tasks? Does it work? Should we give any feedback? There are some arguments that we shouldn't, that it's a waste of time. If the students aren't ready, it's no good. Okay? I don't say whether it's right or wrong, but it's a question you could ask yourselves. What's the role of skills? Can we teach skills as a kind of separate thing to language? Okay? And why do it in class? Why not just, learn grammar and vocabulary, perhaps? I've described these as steps. Hopefully what you understand is it's not necessarily a step in order that you must follow, the ones we've just looked at. But, what is the relative importance of these? So task-based learning, for example, would emphasize usage, giving the students the chance to use the language and this kind of in a natural task and the kind of breakdown in communication leading to learning, okay? And then within each of these phases or steps, what is the practical ways we are going to fulfill them? So this, to my mind, is where the eclecticism comes in, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But, for example, is translation okay in terms of giving meaning? What about drilling in terms of pronunciation and grammar learning? Should we use a course book? Obviously, as a course book writer, I really hope you do, but actually, I'm not as strongly in favour of course books as you might imagine. I spend a lot of time without use of course books, or using taking it as a starting point and where the student's discussion leads me to teach a lot of other language and we go off on a tangent and then the last thing may be motivation. Possibly, is it more important than anything else? But whether we can do anything about that, I'm not sure. That's, again, another question. Okay? So these are kind of areas of debate that we might discuss. So we'll come back to those later, and I shall ask, well, maybe let's just do it now. Okay. Just very briefly, okay, I know it's big questions, but a kind of yes-no type of answer. How would you answer these questions yourselves? Okay, so do exercises and teaching help? So this part we move on to my principles, or principles which exist about language. So this is a kind of key part of teaching lexically, if you like, or a lexical approach. It's really a kind of question about language. So let us look first at the principles of language in most courses and course books that we encounter. Okay? So this is, I would like to say, the inherited approach to language. So let's have a look. The central examples here came from 2 course books, and they're not unusual examples in many ways. The example was, Dracula didn't live in Brazil. Okay? And the second one was, am I studying Chinese? These were the 2 examples that were given. Now, my first question to you would be, why would you say it? Who would you say it to? And when? Is it exchanging thoughts and feelings? Are we learning about other people's culture? Maybe Brazil, I don't know. Dracula didn't live there, we know that. And it's just a bit weird. I mean, I know that sometimes I've been in my classes and I've wondered if I'm speaking Chinese because of my students' looks. But I think it's unusual for students to be in a class and wonder if they're studying Chinese or not. So, in a way, what we're seeing here is grammar as slots. So the idea is we can teach present past simple, Dracula lived in Transylvania, and we just kind of make an opposite, a negative, Dracula didn't live in Brazil. And we kind of have these little slots, and we can put any verbs or in the verb slot, any kind of place after the verb bit, and any pronoun or noun in the first slot, okay? That's the kind of way that we're teaching. Alongside that goes the idea of kind of grammar as a building block and organizing our syllabus basically around grammar. So I actually think lexical teaching is most relevant at the lowest levels. Okay, and I'll come back to that later. What you see in the lowest levels, beginner and elementary, we will not see the word go until about page 30. Okay? Because in the first 4 units, what do we study? To be. Yes, so we'll have be negatives, sometimes, be questions. Am I studying Chinese? Well, it wouldn't be that, no. It would be, am I Chinese, perhaps, would be the question. Okay, and then we get on to present simple. What's important to realize is we do not, in the book, I hope, as teachers, we may not follow the book so religiously, but within the book, there will be no examples of present simple until we have taught the present simple. So in many books, you will not see the sentence, I don't know, until the 5th unit. So we have these conversations where we're kind of constantly misunderstanding. Are you Russian? No, I'm Ukrainian. Maybe here it's an important distinction. Are you from Mexico? Is Javier Bardem from Mexico? No, he's not. He's from Spain. And we have these kind of simple kind of conversations. Went, page 70. Be going to. Maybe sometimes it's not be going to. Maybe sometimes it's just be going. It's kind of present continuous with the future. Probably not till the last unit, page 90, page 100. Have been. Nothing. Have to go. Nothing. Should go. Nothing. Better, best. Nothing. Because these are examples of comparatives and superlatives, not to be taught till elementary or perhaps even pre-intermediate. And then the strange thing about it, which I find strange anyway, okay, I can follow the idea that there's a building block. We might have this idea that we want to go, help the students kind of master one area before we move on to another. It's comforting. The real weird thing I find is, why do we start in exactly the same way in elementary? Where we will go through, first 2 units will be B. Then we'll have up to, not till unit 5 do we get went again. And again, these words are not appearing in the text. And have been, page 100 perhaps. Having been my first time in Ukraine, quite a few people on my acquaintance go, have you been to Ukraine before? It's almost one of the first questions you get asked, okay? Or is it your first time? And you go and say, no, I've never been here before. So one of those most important questions, and we have to, according to the book, wait about 250 hours of teaching before we see it, okay? And maybe better, even then, have to go, should go. Actually, we don't see till pre-intermediate. So I have to go to the toilet. A very important statement in my case, my aging body. I can't actually express until pre-intermediate. By which time there may have been damage made, So, what we should think about are what are the principles underlying this method. So I think, this is very familiar to us, but do we think about the principles underlying it? The principle is that basically grammar and words are separate. We have the grammar, and we fill in the words are kind of single words which can fit into these grammar slots, okay? And as a result, in a way, the meaning of grammar and words are seen as kind of clear and constant. So it's not only that we are separating, we are building blocks of grammar, but we're separating present continuous really for now, like you are wearing a suit, you are listening to me, are you listening to me? Maybe, no, I'm not. Maybe, we kind of separate this out from, for example, present continuous for future meaning. And that's a separate unit which we teach later on. And similarly, words, we just have to learn the meaning. That's all that's required. Further meaning is basically explanation. If there's a kind of mistake with the word, is given by giving a kind of subtlety of meaning and explaining how it works. The grammar provides these slots for these words, and as a result, language is infinitely creative. That's the kind of principle behind it. We teach the grammar rules so that the students can create their language as they wish. It's a kind of more efficient way, perhaps, we could see it. That's the principle, perhaps. Within that, natural usage, I would say, is relatively unimportant. This is why we're fine having sentences like, Dracula didn't live in Brazil, or am I studying Chinese? Because it's not really, what we're teaching is the rule. So the actual example is relatively unimportant. What we're practicing is the pattern, how the pattern works as a kind of mathematics rather than usage. This is not to say that we couldn't have natural examples, which we'll come back to. And then ultimately, grammar is more important. The thing which drives our syllabuses in most courses that I've ever had encounters with, usually if you're a writer, you go to a publisher, the first thing they give you is the grammar syllabus. A grammar syllabus usually based on the other books which are published. So there's a kind of circularity about it. This is the inherited part of it. So this is more important than words, and it's the building blocks of language. Okay. Does this all seem familiar? Yeah? I'm not lying. Okay. So how might we see language differently? Is this true, relatively, a view of language? Similarly, there are some maybe unthought of implications. So if you think language is infinitely creative, then why are we correcting students? Perhaps our students are just being creative with the language. I'll leave that one to think. Okay, so what about grammar? What is this person communicating here? Process? Maybe? Results? What's he saying? Have been ing. Really? Do you know exactly what he wants to say? It doesn't make sense, yeah. How about if we add some more to that for? It's still not really saying anything. Okay, how about this one? What is this person trying to communicate? Imagine. I wanted to see this film for ages. I've been wanting to see this film for ages. Yeah, something along these lines. Okay, now the point is, it's a very simple point, that grammar actually doesn't really communicate anything most of the time. It is the words which drive our communication. Now, this is not, let me be absolutely clear, that I'm not suggesting that we go around encouraging our students to talk in single words like this, linked together. We will need to show them kind of patterns, etc. But the point is, you can communicate, even if they're in a different order to the ones we expect, that the single words, with the context they're talking in, and this is also important, the communication, we can communicate. And it's the words which are more important. So if in doubt, my first principle would be teach words rather than grammar. Sorry if that hurts some of you. The second question is are the things we say really constructed from grammar? Does anybody speak Spanish here? Yeah? Okay. So this first phrase, no te preocupes, it means don't worry. Okay? Now, the thing is, this involves a subjunctive. Subjunctive, very difficult in Spanish. The most painful thing for any Spanish learner to learn. And yet, I learned this phrase probably after about a week in Spain, and I was using it probably after a month quite happily, without knowing what a subjunctive was even about. Okay? So the point is, I hadn't constructed that from the grammar. I constructed it from hearing it as a phrase and using it as a phrase. So this is something to bear in mind. My question is whether perhaps the same might be true of other English phrases. So, you know, if you were not in an English classroom, I would imagine, have you been here before, you would learn as a phrase in the first instance, if you were just acquiring the language from the context. What about this one? He mandubled across the floor. Mandubled is invented. What do you think it might mean? Any suggestions? Slide, walked, limped. Yeah, it's basically some kind of movement verb, okay? So there is this idea, how do we know? It's not exactly from the grammar. It's from this kind, well, it kind of is and it isn't. So it's this, he across the floor. The across the floor kind of gives a context which makes us know that this verb is some kind of movement. So they're kind of, the two things are contributing to each other's meaning, if you like. And the idea is, this is from a guy called Nick Ellis, and he suggests that actually there are lots of these kind of lexical, grammatical patterns which are the basis of how people learn the English in first language, okay? Rather than technically a grammar as such. And again, perhaps we could think for ourselves, perhaps in the first instance, we could teach the pattern, have you been to plus place? That this might be, it's grammar in a way, or is it lexical grammar? It's a pattern anyway. And that we can show the students that. That to me would be a more lexical view of language. And similarly, we'll see this again later, I'm going, or I'm going to, plus a place, going to plus an activity. Ooh, we're crossing borders here between going to and present continuous. Danger, danger. Okay? But I would suggest that they're the same. I shall come back to this later. So, within that, what we have to remember is this. I'm sure you're familiar with it. That native speakers, probably it's the same in Ukrainian. There is some kind of irregular verbs which babies and young children will start saying correctly, and then at some point they start overgeneralizing the regular rule to create wrong things. So in our case, they learnt went, they use went and go correctly, and then suddenly they start saying goed. The thing which we as language teachers should remember is we don't stick to the rule, we stick with usage. So we don't, if the rule was more important, we would all be saying goed, but we don't. We go back to what everybody else is saying, which is went. Usage wins over rules. So there are limits to rules and grammar. This was in a class I had. I was teaching the grammar, infinitives and ing after certain verbs. We had a little practice. One of the students said, he said, I want to see that film for ages. It was the example we had before, more or less. And I constructed it as, I've been wanting to see that film for ages. First question was, want. Not continuous. No, we say it all the time. It's perfectly correct. Unfortunately, this led to the next question. Can I say, I've been fancying seeing that film for ages? And I said, no. And the student said, why? And I said, that's the way it is, okay? I mean, you can actually say, you can say it if you like, it's just that, English speakers don't. Or my community of English speakers don't. Because in the end, grammar is, it's conformity. So what we're doing and the patterns we use are conforming to what other people in our community of language speakers say, which is why English is different in different parts of the world, and it's why English changes over time. This is not a new idea. This is from 1986. Paula and Saidi wrote their article. And they give the example of time. It's 5:40. It's correct. It's 6 less 20. No. It's 2/3 past 5. No. It's 40 past 5. No. All these other ones, grammatically, they're entirely correct. Nothing wrong with them. But practically, English or UK speakers don't say these things. Maybe in other languages, you do say it exceeds 5 by 40. It's possible. So, the next question, this was from a beginner book I was writing recently. In the first draft, I didn't have, "Look, here's Lizzie." So the first draft was, "Where is everyone?" We said 3 o'clock, and the other person replies, "They're coming." So it's a person waiting for a meeting to start. Okay? The editor said to me, "That's a future meaning." And I said, "Is it?" I was thinking of it as a present meaning. So then I added, "Look, here's Lizzie," just to make sure that we're in present. Okay? But the reality is, no speaker would be asking this question, whether it's present or future. They would just accept it as being the reality of what you would ask. They don't kind of worry about it. And similarly, as you go along, we're waiting for everyone, yeah, they're coming, Jamie's getting coffee. Is this kind of now or the future? Again, there's a certain kind of ambiguity about it. And this is the reality, actually, of all our grammar. We try to make a distinction, but it's very difficult for real life not to impose. So this is an example from another course. They're trying to separate everyday with temporary. And the situation is, it's an undercover boss. So the boss is based on a TV program. The boss is going and doing the workers' jobs instead of being the boss, and kind of experiencing what they do. So David is cleaning rooms today. He's the boss. So he doesn't usually clean rooms, but he does today. The workers only have a quarter of an hour to clean the room, normally, and David is working very hard. There is a question here whether he doesn't work very hard normally. Okay, so that's the first question. But then later on, he goes, after the program, David changes some things. He gives the good workers more money. And I thought, well, is that every day that he changes some things? Is it always that he gives the workers more money?
He'd be broke.
Yes, exactly, he'd be broke. Yeah. So, we're constantly trying to separate these meanings, but the reality is the meaning is fuzzy. Because the meaning comes from our experience of the language, not from a rule. And so, when we are trying to impose these rules and these definitions, it's unsurprising when the students get things wrong, because usage wins over rules. Same thing happens with words. So we have table, pull, out. I think let's take the word pull, for example, here. Okay, just again with the person next to you. In the first 3 examples, so come on, everybody, pull, pull. Pull my hair, it's pulling a big trailer. Would that be the same word which you would transpull in all of these examples? Okay, maybe yes, maybe no. Because again, if you think about pull, I mean, in a way you can see a link, how they are all similar, but really they are showing different kinds of pulling. And, we can give the definition, but in the reality, the students will only learn about what pull covers, by knowing the examples and seeing the examples in collocations. So, in the end, pulled out without looking, pulled out of the deal, in a way the collocation is kind of working together to create the meaning. And we could kind of think of these as units of meaning rather than as single words. Okay? So, similarly at the end, had an argument, presented an argument. It changes the meaning of argument. Again, you might translate these as differently. As a result of that, each collocation has a different collocation, has a different colligation, has a different text, co-text, etc. Just think of old car and new car. My old car, the old car breaks down more than a new car. So we'd expect to see words like break down, rusty, etc. With old car, but not with new car. So the collocation, even a simple collocation, can often change everything about what it is to know a word. So you may have come across this, especially if you've done a CELTA or Delta or whatever. This idea that knowing a word, you have to know, I mean, there's actually longer lists than this. You need to know collocation, colligation, that's kind of grammar that goes with it. The co-text, the words that go in a kind of typical conversation or a typical text. The opposites of those words. The word families, the pragmatic use, meaning we say something wanting something else to happen. It's not a kind of explicit thing. Lexical sets might change. So if you take collocation, have an argument, present an argument, these will work differently. So the collocations and colligation of this have an argument about, but present an argument for or against. We would often say, I don't want to have an argument, but unusual to say, I don't want to present an argument. Similarly, the collocations, the adjective collocations will be different. Have a terrible argument, but present, what would it be? If it was present a bad argument, perhaps, okay? But not present a furious argument, okay? Similarly, if you think about how these words are used contextually, if somebody was talking about an argument, I might say how it happened. Oh, she phoned me, what was it about? She was really upset, calm down. These kinds of things might be within the conversation or the text. Whereas when we're presenting an argument, we would expect to see things like, I'm going to present an argument about teaching lexically today. I will start by giving you a view of language, and I'll go on to give you some examples of how you can use that in the classroom. Yeah? Similarly, the opposites. So rather than thinking of opposites of single words, we might start thinking of opposites as of units of meaning of our whole phrase. So have an argument. The opposite is probably have a chat or have a laugh, perhaps we could think of. So you imagine the conversation happening. Were you two having an argument? No. We were just having a laugh. Nothing serious. Okay? Whereas present an argument, the opposite would be challenge or respond to an argument. But then, if you present an award, the opposite is different again. Receive an award, etc. So the opposites will depend on the context, the whole unit of meaning, the collocation. Word families, again, they're made distinct. So, when you're having an argument, you might be talking about somebody being argumentative. They're always arguing. We never argue. Whereas present argument, something is arguable. And interestingly, you would nearly always use it in a present simple in this meaning. Okay? Couldn't think of many pragmatic uses of present an argument, but I thought of they're having, outside an office, they're having an argument. Okay. I'll come back later. Don't go in, don't knock. The lexical sets may be different. And similarly, also, we might think that the synonyms don't work exactly. So sometimes we could use row as a synonym of argument, but quite often it's marginal. So actually, if you look on the internet, center of a growing row, center of a growing argument are not equally presented, and obviously present a row is never happens. Okay? Last thing perhaps to think about here is how many words do students need to know? What I'm going to show you is not necessarily how much they must know. This is just a reflection of how many words cover a text. So, if you looked in a text, how many of them would be the same words? So, the first 1,000 words cover about 72% of a text. So any text you look at, if you took out the top 1,000 words, you would have about 28% of the text left, etc. 2,000 is about 80%, 3,000, 84, etc. So, for students, they can progress quite quickly to an intermediate or whatever, and maybe on a conversational level, they may need less than these, obviously. You can see how they can progress. The bottom one is for educated native students at university. This is about how much they would cover, like an academic text. The important thing is the 97% there, which apparently is what you need to know in the text in order to be able to guess unknown words. So we often tell the students, guess the unknown word. Very commonly, if it's the same experience as I've had, the students either get it wrong or they just don't know what it is, and quite possibly the reason for that is because they don't know enough of the other language in the text. Because to do it accurately, you need to know at least 97% of the text. My conclusion is that the biggest work for a student, the difference, for example, between an intermediate student and an advanced student is basically nothing to do with grammar. It's about 6,000 words, 5,000 words. And we then have to think, these are 5,000 words meaning, but as we've seen, they also need to know the collocation, the colligation, the way they're used in context, the other words they go with, the opposites, if they're going to use them well. This is a huge task. And it seems to me that sometimes our focus on grammar is diverting us from the true task which the students need to follow. So I'll be talking about this more in detail tomorrow, but from that point of view, for me, skills are more about, so talking reading and listening skills, are basically about being a bad listener or a bad reader is fundamentally about not knowing enough vocabulary. And the reasons why we might do it and encourage students to do it is to show them and get experience of how the words they know work and develop a kind of automaticity of recognizing these things. So that is a kind of view of lexical view of language. How might it be different to our grammar plus words view? How might you change some of these to be a kind of more lexical view? So these might be the way we would look at it. The first thing is language is essentially lexically driven. So there is this idea that the grammar comes out of lexis and how we use words. That words ultimately are more important. They have a value and they're the biggest task for the students. But we need to think of words less as kind of single plus a meaning and more as a kind of unit of meaning. So that's a kind of collocation, phrase, group of words together. And that those can be what we conceive of grammar. So have you been to me, would be a lexical unit of meaning in the first instance, at least. With that, what we have to remember is that meaning is not clear-cut either for grammar or words. It's fuzzy. So we can give the meaning, but that in a way is the smallest part of the student's job. The way it's used will be how is different. And that actually is not constant. So we're not speaking in the same way as Shakespeare, or even actually the same way as my parents spoke. Language changes because we are doing it based on our experience of what other people are saying. And our primary thing is conformity to what other people are saying. So the usage is actually emerging from our experience of language as it's used. And as a result, also, correctness cannot be absolute. This actually means that everybody's English is different. So my English is actually different to my colleague Hugh's, it's different to my parents, it's different to my wife's. Everybody has this individual. So in fact, they have this idea of forensic linguistics now, where they can kind of analyze texts to see if it's relative, almost like a fingerprint of somebody, okay? For us, for you, as perhaps non-native speakers of English, what we should take from that is your English is the correct English. Your English is what you're going to teach to your students. When I'm talking about naturalness, what I'm saying is something which is natural to you and which you would want to say. So it's about what we want to say. It's about the communication of thoughts and feelings. It's the business of everyday life and how you realize that with your English, and that's more important than a kind of Dracula lived in Brazil, which is unnatural. Okay? Within that, we should think there's more number of patterns, kind of lexical, grammatical patterns, which will include the grammar that we're familiar with, but there are other ones as well. Okay? And that maybe we could exploit those a little bit. And the last thing which I should have mentioned before is when we teach, for example, present perfect continuous, I mean, in English, that would be less than 1% of the usage of tenses in English. But furthermore, within that 1%, or less than 1%, the number of examples, number of verbs which realize present perfect continuous will probably be about, 5, will make up about 80% of all those usage. Doing, working, living, that's probably, 3 would probably make up the majority. So a lexical view might be that we teach students how to use "how long have you been doing that" in lots of different conversations, rather than teaching it necessarily as a grammar have plus been plus ing. So the question then is, what do you think so far? Which view of language do you have most sympathy with? No need to agree. How far, but perhaps more importantly, how far does your teaching reflect your preferred view of language? Obviously, the first thing, what language to teach, I would be thinking primarily vocabulary, but primarily as collocations or chunks. And within that, not forgetting our first principles of why students are learning, thinking about the outcomes, what the students want to actually say with their language to fulfill the business of everyday life or exchange thoughts or feelings. Some of that grammar can be as words, as chunks. So we can, especially at the lower levels, we'll give you an example of that. We might focus a little bit more on patterns, lexico-grammatical patterns. One of my favorites is the just because I'm English doesn't mean I'm cold and unfriendly, okay? So we have this pattern, just because doesn't mean. Is it grammar? Is it words? It's a kind of somewhere in between. But it kind of functions as a pattern and can be very productive for students to explore that. The noun phrases, yes, I think is maybe just some area where we underteach, actually, partly because it's kind of word grammar rather than tense grammar. Teaching and learning, teaching and acquiring, as the lady said so accurately, it helps a bit. So for me, I think we can teach basic meanings of verbs, words, phrases, probably using L1, actually, to a large degree. And we can help a bit showing them how usage works. So pointing out collocations, pointing out the grammar of words, collocations, colligation, etc. But, and maybe Vitaly will be confirming this later in a moment, actually the way that students will really become accurate is through exposure. We cannot teach everything it is to know a word. They can only learn it through trying to use it themselves in interaction with other people, and through lots of reading and listening of this language, is my view. The noticing, the teaching, might help them notice that as they're going through. So, it might support the exposure, but we will need that. So then you think about the order. We'll be teaching kind of frequent words, so I kind of have an emphasis on frequency, thinking about the most common words. A little example of that, I might teach things like create jobs, good for the economy, a good health system, at a kind of beginner elementary level. Because actually these words are within the top 100, 200 most common words in English. But they're not typical elementary level words. Teach grammar as phrases, patterns, thinking about grammar, but maybe just enough for them to maybe have their conversation rather than everything about it. And then at higher levels, we might think about, again, still thinking about frequency, but the kind of mid-frequency. If you've got a Macmillan book, dictionary, you might have the 2-star words, if you're familiar with those. Thinking about those, or thinking about more idiomatic collocations with words they know already. And then at all levels, what I will be doing is following what the students are saying, or trying to say. So this is where we may break out of the course book. The students, in response to a task in the course book, often will try and say things which they haven't been taught yet. And what I do is help them do that. So I will teach them language which may be apparently well above their level. But in that moment, it enables them to have the conversation. They won't learn it at that moment. But over time, perhaps when we do an exercise, they'll re-encounter it, or when they see it in a reading or listening, they'll re-encounter it, and it's through that process that they will learn. So just a kind of example, these are from, I wrote this book last year, Beginner Outcomes. It's just come out. And what we tried to do is teach some things which would not normally be in a beginner book as phrases. So we teach called. You could think of it as a reduced relative clause. But it's a restaurant. Do you know a restaurant called whatever? Okay? It's a kind of useful little pattern for the students. Best. Best is like, an essential word, but doesn't get taught till way in elementary. But, it's a useful pattern to be able to say, what's the best restaurant near here? What's the best place to go? It's the best thing to do. And again, for a student, it's very simple. What's the best restaurant? They say the reply in Ukrainian. It's the name. And they might have an argument about it. And then as a teacher, we might follow what they're trying to say to help them explain why they think it's the best. Because it's cheap, it's fun to go to, they've got great food. Have you been? We have the example, but it's have you been plus place. The answer's yes or no. We don't need to have yes, I have, no, I haven't. It doesn't add to the communication. It's enough for them to fulfill their needs at this point. It's another one, where are you going? Kind of buying a ticket. And then what we do is to take those sometimes and build on them as grammar exercises. So here we've got planning after a class. What are you doing after the class? We give them some examples which they hear first, so it's kind of exposure first, recognizing it, but only I'm examples. I'm going. And we give them the pattern. It's grammar, but it's more of a lexical grammar. So I'm going, we're going, plus where, and then when. We give them that pattern. We don't teach them they, she, it at this point. It's not important. I want to know your plans, not my mother's plans. I want to know what you're doing, not what you're not doing. So in this first instance, that's all the students need. They have a pattern to follow. They put it into a little context, and then they write their own. And at this point, again, the students may go off tangent. They may just copy what they've just seen, because that's what they do already, because usage is more important, or they might, give their own ideas, and we would help them with that. We then teach them some questions to enable them to build on this conversation. Are you going? What time are you going? What are you doing? Very simple. They don't, again, need to know all the different forms at this point, but they will learn about them at another time. For example, where is everyone? They're coming. And as a result, what you get is, if you look at the traditional method, where we're doing a building block, the examples of being will be limited to a couple of units at the end of the book, 10 lessons, they get 35 examples. Whereas, because we've taught this in Unit 5, this one is from Unit 5, quite early, we can then recycle it in listenings and readings that they see. As a teacher, I will ask this regularly at the end of the class, what are you doing now? The students can have a go at answering. And as a result, we get a kind of spiral syllabus instead. And the number of examples, 5 times as many. And for me, the exposure is an important part of their acquisition of this structure. So in a way, the building block approach is reducing our exposure to certain tenses, etc. I'm going to leave that one on for the moment. Just the relative importance. For me then, meaning in a way is the smallest part. The biggest part is actually this noticing the context, the collocations, etc. And that will only happen through repeated encounters over time in different contexts. So this in a way is the most important point from my point of view. Obviously, the other things are there as well, but these are kind of relatively important. So, just a kind of final thing, just 2 minutes again. I think we're finishing it. You're on 10:2, yeah? Yep. The eclecticism now comes, from my point of view, in how we do these different things. So I have a clear idea of the view of language. So the item is the most important, is the kind of difference for me between the kind of traditional method and my approach. That I'm looking to teach groups of words together in combination and show them how they're used in natural language. Grammar is secondary to that. It comes through the teaching of vocabulary. So within these different things, any suggestions of what we might do? This is where eclecticism comes in. Because understanding the meaning of an item, okay, the difference for me here is I would translate. So I would take that idea of translation from grammar translation. But what I'm translating is not things like the pen of my aunt is in the garden, or Dracula lived in Brazil. It would be just thinking about natural examples, ways they might be used. So what are you doing tonight? What are you doing now? I would translate this as one way of giving meaning. Perfectly fine, to my mind. So the problem is not the method, it's the language here, because I'm thinking of a lexical view. So seeing the item in context, for me, it would be more important to give examples of listening and reading. But the listening, for example, is not there to present grammar. It's there to present a conversation. So it's the conversation which is driving the listening, and the language within that I might draw attention to. Approximate the sounds of the... I would drill. So this might be from audiolingualism. I would get the students to repeat. Maybe, what are you doing after the class? Nothing. What are you doing after the class? Going to the cafe. What are you doing after the class? I'm going home. It's a drill, but it's not, what are you doing after the class? I am going after the class to have a coffee. So it's not that kind of repetition, you know, where are you from? I am from Azerbaijan, or I am from Georgia. Yeah? For me, what I would drill is, where are you from? Georgia. This would be the reality of language. So the drill is based on real examples of how we have these conversations, rather than trying to teach grammar. Pay attention to the item and notice its features. Obviously, some of these might through kind of concept checking questions, communicative language teaching. But I might change, we'll see this tomorrow, exactly the kinds of questions I ask. So in a way, for me, the eclecticism then is, you know, it can come from lots of different sources, so long as we are still focused on exchanging thoughts and feelings, communicating the business of everyday life, naturalness in the sense of we can understand that this conversation might take place, not native accuracy, and that we're helping the students and exposing them to these kinds of conversations constantly. Okay? And that is the end of my first session. Thank you very much.